What would you do if the person you trust the most abandoned you at the most critical moment of your life? She needed an urgent transplant, a surgery that would determine her survival. Her own husband promised to be by her side but disappeared without a trace when the surgery date arrived. In the days that followed, her life took an unexpected turn, filled with twists no one could foresee. This is a story of betrayal and resilience that will keep you hooked from start to finish. Every detail of this drama is deeper than it seems, and what happened after his disappearance will leave you speechless. Stay until the end, because the truth that comes to light is as surprising as it is emotional. Eleanor sat in the cold chair of the waiting room, nervously fidgeting with her hands when the doctor entered. The sound of the clock on the wall seemed to grow louder with every passing second, marking the moment she knew would change her life forever. The doctor closed the door with a soft click, sat down across from Eleanor and sighed. "The results are in, Eleanor," the doctor began, her expression serious. "You have advanced liver failure. You will need a transplant, and quickly." For a moment, the world stopped. Eleanor blinked, trying to process what she had just heard. She had always been the strong one, the one who handled everything. A dedicated teacher, loved by her students, married to Steve, with whom she shared a simple but satisfying life. Now that life was crumbling before her eyes, and there was nothing she could do to prevent it. "Transplant?" she repeated, as if the word carried an extra weight in her mind, something that needed to be deciphered. "Yes," the doctor replied, her voice a little softer now. "If we don't find a compatible donor soon, your options will be limited." Eleanor swallowed hard, feeling a wave of fear wash over her. "How much time do I have?" The doctor hesitated for a moment before answering, a human reflection of not wanting to deliver the harsh news. "A few months, maybe less." Eleanor couldn't speak. The room seemed to spin as she processed the gravity of the situation. It was as if her mind was trying to find an escape, a magical solution. But there was no magic, it was real. She was dying. When she got home that night, Steve was sitting on the couch, distracted by the television. The sound of the football game filled the room. Eleanor stood for a moment watching him, trying to find the right words to start the conversation. But there was a feeling of disconnection there, an invisible gap that suddenly seemed larger than ever. "Steve!" she called, her voice weaker than she had expected. "Can we talk?" Steve turned off the TV, looking at her with a hint of irritation. "What's up? Is everything okay?" Eleanor sat down next to him, feeling the weight of the day pressing down on her shoulders. "I went to the doctor today. My tests didn't go well." Steve frowned, but his concern seemed superficial, almost automatic. "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "My liver. It's failing. I need a transplant, and soon." For a moment, the silence between them felt like it lasted an eternity. Steve blinked a few times, as if he were trying to process the information. "Transplant?" he murmured, echoing her words. "Yes," she repeated. "You might be a match. The doctor suggested you get tested." He shook his head, still dazed. "This is serious." "It is," Eleanor replied, her voice breaking a little. "It's very serious." Steve nodded slowly, but Eleanor noticed something in his gaze that unsettled her. It wasn't the reaction of someone desperate, ready to save their loved one. There was no panic or urgency that she expected. He was cold, distant, as if the news was about someone else, not the woman he had promised to spend his life with. That night, Eleanor couldn't sleep. The silence beside her, in the space where Steve should have been, was deafening. He had gone to the living room, saying he needed to think, but she knew something was wrong. He seemed worried, yes, but there was something more. Something she couldn't decipher. Days passed, and Steve finally agreed to take the compatibility test. Eleanor hoped that knowing he could save her life would bring some connection between them. But strangely, that didn't happen. Steve seemed to avoid any conversation about the transplant. changing the subject whenever the topic arose. On the day the test results arrived, Eleanor was in the kitchen, trying to act as if life was still normal. She stirred her coffee absent-mindedly when the phone rang. On the other end of the line, the doctor's voice sounded distant, almost unreal. "Steve is a match," the doctor said. "That's excellent news. We can schedule the surgery as soon as he's ready." Eleanor felt a deep relief, a faint light at the end of the tunnel. It was the first time in weeks she felt hope. She rushed to the living room, where Steve was once again watching TV. "Steve!" she exclaimed, a mix of relief and urgency in her voice. "You're a match. We can schedule the surgery." Steve looked at her, but there was no smile, no glimmer of relief that she expected. He merely nodded, diverting his gaze. "That's good," he said, lacking enthusiasm. Eleanor furrowed her brow. "You don't seem happy." Steve turned off the television and stood up. "I just need some time to think. It's not a simple decision, Eleanor." "It's not a simple decision," she repeated incredulously. "We're talking about my life, Steve. You can save me." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know, but there's a lot going on. Work, bills. It's not as easy as you think." Eleanor was left speechless. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Are you serious? I'm dying, Steve." He didn't respond. He just grabbed his keys and walked out the door, leaving Eleanor alone, feeling a chill in her spine that had nothing to do with her illness. Something was deeply wrong. It wasn't just the fear of losing her life. It was the fear of losing the person she had thought she knew. Hours later, as darkness settled over the house, Eleanor lay staring at the ceiling, her mind spinning around Steve's silence. He had left and hadn't returned, his phone going unanswered. At that moment, Eleanor realized that the problem was much bigger than a failing liver. Something terrible was happening, and she had no idea how to fix it. And this was just the beginning. What was really behind Steve's behavior? The house was enveloped in silence. Eleanor stared at the plate in front of her, pushing the food from one side to the other without actually eating. The physical pain was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore, but the emotional anguish that was consuming her at that moment felt even worse. Steve sat at the other end of the table, his attention fixed on the TV, even though the sound was barely audible. They hadn't exchanged more than a few words all night. The distance between them felt palpable, almost like an invisible presence, but impossible to ignore. She couldn't take it anymore. Something had been wrong for weeks, and every attempt to reach out to him had failed. She was dying, and Steve seemed more distant with each passing day, as if he were waiting for the worst to happen. There was no support, no comfort, just that cold, uncomfortable emptiness. "Steve!" she called, her voice soft but firm. He didn't turn. He continued staring at the TV, pretending he hadn't heard her. Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling a sharp pang in her chest that had nothing to do with her illness. "Steve, we need to talk." Without looking at her, he replied, "About what?" "About what's happening," she insisted, feeling her voice tremble. "You're distant, acting like you don't care." He turned off the TV with a heavy sigh and finally looked at her, but his eyes were empty, lacking the warmth she remembered. "I don't know what you want me to say, Eleanor." "I want you to be honest," she replied, her emotions spilling over. "I'm sick. I need you. I need to understand what's going on, why you're like this." For a moment, he said nothing. He just stared at her with an unreadable expression, but then something changed. His expression hardened, and he abruptly stood up from the table, the chairs scraping against the wooden floor. "Eleanor, don't you understand?" he exploded, his voice louder and more aggressive than she had ever heard before. "I'm tired! Tired of this whole situation, of you, of the illness, of everything!" She was in shock. "Tired of me?" she whispered, hardly believing what she was hearing. "Yes!" Steve continued, gesturing wildly. "Can't you see? I'm suffocating. Every day is a burden. Your illness, this house, everything. I can't live like this anymore." Eleanor felt the air escape her lungs. The fear, the confusion, the pain, all swirled together in a storm inside her. I didn't choose this," she murmured. "I didn't choose to be sick, Steve. I just need you." He laughed, a bitter laugh that made her shrink back in her chair. "Need me? Eleanor, you need a lot more than I can offer. I'm not going to ruin my life for someone who's already counting their days." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She blinked, tears filling her eyes, unable to process what he had just said. "How can you say that?" Steve turned away, looking out the window as if he needed space. "Because it's the truth, Eleanor. You're going to die. And I don't want to be here when that happens. I can't." She was trembling now, both from pain and shock. "So what are you going to do?" she asked, her voice nearly fading away. "I'm leaving," he replied, devoid of emotion. "I've been seeing someone else for a while, someone who makes me feel alive again." The confession fell like a bombshell. He was not only abandoning her, he was cheating on her, and had been for some time. The physical betrayal was devastating, but it was the fact that he had already decided to move on while she was still fighting for her life that shattered her completely. Another person? Eleanor could hardly believe it. She could barely muster the strength to stand, let alone fight against the news she had just received. "Yes," he said, now with less aggression but still without remorse. "She's healthy. I can have a normal life with her, not this miserable existence we have now." Eleanor felt her body collapse inward, tears streaming down her face as she looked at him in disbelief. "You're going to leave me now, when I need you the most?" He stared at her for a moment, and she hoped to see some sign of regret, some trace of the man she had married. But all she found was indifference. "Yes," he said calmly, "I am." And without another word, Steve grabbed his keys and walked out the door. Eleanor heard the sound of the car starting and driving away, leaving her alone in the house they had shared for years, the house where they had planned a future together. Now, there was no future. That night, Eleanor tried to sleep, but the silence was deafening. Every noise seemed to amplify the void left by Steve. She thought about what would come next, but all she could feel was despair. He had taken their savings, the little they had set aside for emergencies. The reality was clear. Without the money, she couldn't afford her treatment. Without Steve, she was literally left to her own devices. The next day, when she woke up, she found the bed beside her still empty. He hadn't come back. She walked around the house, her footsteps echoing in the silence. Every detail felt like a cruel reminder of what she had lost. Steve's shoes were no longer by the door. His clothes had vanished from the closet. He had really left. It wasn't a nightmare she could wake up from. She sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the floor, and the tears began to fall again. It wasn't just the fear of dying that devastated her. It was the fear of dying alone, without anyone by her side. Hours later, Eleanor felt her body weaken and her chest tighten. Was it the illness? Was it a broken heart? She no longer knew. All she knew was that she was being consumed from the inside out. And as she tried to find the strength to decide what to do next, one question continued to echo in her mind. What would she do now without Steve and without hope? If you're enjoying the story so far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment your thoughts. This is really important for the channel's growth and for more people to discover this story. Let's continue with the next exciting events. Eleanor woke up on the living room sofa, her body curled up, her face still wet from the tears of the previous night. The house was in absolute silence, with not a single sign of Steve. This was no longer a nightmare. It was a harsh reality. He was gone, taking with him everything they could have used to fight against the illness. The emptiness that remained was unbearable. The weight of betrayal added to the constant physical pain that had been eroding her strength. Every movement was a reminder that time was running out for her. Her health was deteriorating day by day, and the options were dwindling. She had tried calling Steve, begging for a response, but his phone was off. He didn't want to be found. There was nothing more to be done. Deep down, Eleanor knew that insisting wouldn't change anything. He had made his decision. Desperation grew with each passing second, not just from the lack of hope, but also from the solitude that enveloped her like a heavy, suffocating shroud. In the following days, Eleanor realized she couldn't continue in that state. With no money and her health rapidly declining, the only thing left was the help of friends. The problem was that asking for help had never been easy for her. She had always been the strong one, the one who solved everyone else's problems. Now her life was out of control, and admitting it felt like defeat. She picked up the phone with trembling hands and dialed Sarah's number, a longtime friend. The two had been close since college, but their contact had dwindled over the years as their daily routines grew more demanding. Sarah, however, was the kind of friend who, even from a distance, would always do her best to help. "Hello?" Sarah's voice echoed on the other end, familiar and comforting. "Sarah, it's me, Eleanor." Eleanor's voice was weak, almost unrecognizable. "Elle, are you okay?" Sarah asked, concern evident. It was clear she sensed something was wrong. Eleanor paused, swallowing the remaining pride before responding. "No, I'm not. I need help." The line fell silent for a moment as Sarah processed what she was hearing. "I'm coming over right now," she replied firmly. When Sarah arrived at Eleanor's house, she found her friend crumpled on the sofa. It was painful to see someone who had always been so strong and independent now reduced to physical and emotional weakness. Eleanor could barely look at Sarah as she explained the situation. Steve's betrayal, the lack of money, and worst of all, the urgent need for a transplant. With tears in her eyes, Sarah took Eleanor's hand. "We're going to figure this out. I promise, you're not alone." In the following days, Sarah organized an online fundraising campaign, sharing Eleanor's story and her battle for life. Friends, family, and even colleagues Eleanor hadn't seen in years began to contribute what they could. Determined, Sarah spent hours on social media and making calls, seeking help. The solidarity was real, but still, the amount raised fell far short of what was needed for the surgery. Eleanor, however, was in a state of emotional numbness. Sarah's support kept her upright, but inside she felt on the verge of collapse. The physical pain continued to worsen, and she knew time was running out. With each passing day, the prospect of finding a donor seemed more unlikely, and the feeling of helplessness consumed her. One night, alone in her bed, Eleanor stared at the ceiling, her body too weak to move. She couldn't see how she could survive another day. Her breathing was heavy, the pain was constant, and deep down, she thought this would be the end. The sensation of giving up felt almost comforting. There would be no more struggle, no more suffering. It was as if finally the weight was about to be lifted from her shoulders. Then the phone rang. The sound sliced through the silence of the house like a knife. With great effort, Eleanor reached for it to answer. "Hello?" Her voice came out as a whisper. "Eleanor Parker?" The voice on the other end sounded professional, but there was a hint of urgency. "Yes, this is me. Who is this?" "This is from the hospital. We have a compatible donor for you. We need you to come in as soon as possible to start preparations." For a moment, Eleanor didn't know how to react. Relief and disbelief mingled within her. She was on the brink of death, devoid of hope, and now out of nowhere an opportunity appeared. Fear began to seep in along with doubt. Who would have made this sacrifice? Why now, so close to the deadline? But more than anything, what she felt in that moment was relief. She had a chance, small, uncertain, but a chance to live. Unable to get up by herself, Eleanor called Sarah, who arrived quickly. Upon hearing the news, Sarah let out a scream of joy. and tears of relief streamed down her face. "You're going to make it, Hel! Everything is going to be okay!" As Sarah helped Eleanor prepare to go to the hospital, both tried to ignore the fear still lingering in the air. The surgery would be risky, and Eleanor's condition didn't help. But the mere fact that there was a chance, however small, was more than Eleanor could have hoped for. At the hospital, the nurses moved quickly, preparing everything for the surgery. Lying in the bed, Eleanor stared at the white ceiling and listened to the constant hum of machines around her. Everything felt surreal, as if she were watching from the outside, unable to believe this was actually happening. The last thing she heard before being sedated was Sarah's voice, holding her hand. "I love you, Elle. You're going to get through this." As the world around her began to fade into the darkness of anesthesia, an unsettling thought crossed her mind. Who had made this sacrifice for her? Would Eleanor survive the surgery? And who was the mysterious donor? Eleanor slowly woke up. The soft sunlight was streaming through the hospital window, and the monotonous hum of the machines around her was the only sound filling the room. She blinked a few times, feeling her body heavy and sore. Her head was still foggy, but one thing was certain: she was alive. The pain in her abdomen was intense. Every movement seemed to require more strength than she had. But there was something different now. The oppressive feeling of imminent death that had accompanied her every day had vanished. In its place was a strange emptiness, but also a thin thread of hope. The surgery had been a success, but the doctor had been clear. The recovery would be long and arduous. Sarah was sitting beside the bed, dark circles under her eyes and a relieved smile on her face. When Eleanor finally noticed her, a weak smile formed on her lips. "You're here," Eleanor whispered, her voice hoarse. "I told you it would be okay," Sarah replied, her voice thick with emotion. "But you really scared me." Eleanor tried to laugh, but the movement tugged at her recent scar and she grunted in pain. "I think I'll need some time before I can laugh again." "You have all the time in the world now," Sarah said, holding her hand. "We made it, Elle. You have a new chance." Those words echoed in Eleanor's mind. A new chance. It was a simple phrase, but it carried so much weight. The physical recovery was the first hurdle. But what would come after? What would she do with this life that had almost been lost? Days in the hospital dragged on. Each morning, Eleanor would wake up and stare at the white ceiling, wondering how long it would be until she could leave that place. The nurses were kind, but the recovery process was painful. Moving was torture, and the extreme weakness left her feeling frustrated. The idea of returning to her old life seemed distant, as if it belonged to someone else. However, amidst Sarah's visits and brief moments of peace, Eleanor began to reflect on what she truly wanted for the future. The betrayal by Steve, though devastating, would not define her. She was alive, and that alone was a miracle. The past, no matter how painful, could no longer imprison her. It was during one of these moments of introspection that Eleanor remembered an old dream, something that had always been dormant inside her: to open her own business. Since her college days, she had a passion for crafting, for creating things with her own hands. It was a passion she had never had the chance to fully explore, swallowed up by her job as a teacher and the years of a marriage that, in the end, had been a lie. "Sarah, I want to open my own business," Eleanor said one day as her friend was changing the flowers in the hospital room. Sarah stopped, surprised. "A business? What kind of business?" Eleanor looked at her still fragile hands, but with growing determination. "Crafting. I've always wanted a small shop to sell handmade things. Life has always been so hectic. I never had the chance. But now I feel like this is what I want to do. Something that's mine, something I can build." Sarah smiled. "Hell, that's amazing. If that's what you want, we're going to make it happen. You have talent. And more than that, you have strength." The following days were filled with planning and excited discussions about the future. Eleanor, still confined to the hospital, felt a spark of hope ignite within her. She began to sketch ideas, think of names for the shop, and products she would like to sell. Sarah, always by her side, offered ideas, help, and above all, unconditional support. After weeks in the hospital, Eleanor was finally discharged. The journey to the exit felt endless, each step a challenge. But as she crossed the threshold, she felt the fresh air on her face for the first time in a long while. Sarah helped her into the car, and as they drove back home, Eleanor closed her eyes and took a deep breath. She had a plan, a dream, and this time she wouldn't let anyone get in her way. However, life, as always, had its own plans. Less than a week after returning home, Eleanor was organizing some materials at her makeshift workspace when the doorbell rang. Thinking it was Sarah, she slowly made her way to the door, still feeling the pain of recovery with each step. When she opened the door, it wasn't Sarah standing there, but Samantha, Steve's sister. The initial shock of seeing her was enough to make Eleanor stop dead in her tracks. "Samantha," she said, her voice laced with surprise. It had been months since she last saw her sister-in-law, and the last interactions with Steve had not exactly been friendly. "Hi, Eleanor," Samantha replied, her expression serious. Can I come in?" Eleanor hesitated for a moment but nodded, stepping aside to let her in. They sat in the small living room, the atmosphere charged with unspoken tension. "Samantha, I don't know why you're here, but if it's about Steve, It's about Steve," Samantha interrupted. "Eleanor, I know things ended terribly between you two, and I'm not here to justify anything, but you need to know what happened." Eleanor felt a chill run down her spine. "What do you mean?" Samantha looked at her with an expression that suggested she was about to reveal something disturbing. "Steve, he's missing." Eleanor felt her stomach churn. "Missing? What do you mean?" "He ran away after things went wrong with that scheme he got involved in. The police are searching for him, but no one knows where he is." The revelation hit her like a punch. Steve, who had taken everything from her, was now running from the law. Eleanor was speechless for a few moments. Samantha continued. "But that's not all," Samantha said, her voice dropping lower. "Before he disappeared, he did something unexpected, something you need to know." Eleanor felt her heart race, her mind racing in 1,000 directions. What did he do? Eleanor was frozen in place upon hearing Samantha's words. Steve's name echoed in her mind, mingled with the bitter memories of betrayal and abandonment. She could hardly process what Samantha had just said. He ran away? Pyramid scheme? The police? It all seemed like an absurd plot, almost unreal, as if it wasn't part of her life. But there was Samantha sitting across from her, clearly uncomfortable, waiting for a reaction. "What do you mean he ran away?" Eleanor finally asked, her voice low and trembling. "What exactly did he do?" Samantha took a deep breath, as if preparing to unearth sordid details. "Steve. He got involved in a pyramid scheme right after he left. He used the money he stole from you to try to multiply it quickly. He was obsessed with the idea of making more money, of restarting his life with the other woman." Eleanor felt a mix of disgust and rage rising within her. Of course, Steve had found a way to dig himself even deeper. The man she thought she knew, who swore to stand by her in her toughest moments, not only abandoned her but also stole what they had in one last act of selfishness and desperation. But what hit her hardest was the coldness of his actions. He didn't think about her for a second. Her illness, her struggle for life, simply didn't matter to him. "He lost everything, Eleanor," Samantha continued, her voice softer, as if feeling the weight of the words she was saying. "The scheme was a scam, like most of them, and now he's on the run. I have no idea where he might be." Eleanor shook her head, trying to organize her thoughts. Part of her wanted to feel relief, a dark satisfaction that Steve was finally facing the consequences of his actions, but instead she felt empty. There was no pleasure or sense of justice, only a deep sadness and a void that seemed to grow with each new revelation. "So he's being hunted," Eleanor said, almost to herself. Samantha nodded. "Yeah. And honestly, he deserves it. I'm not here to defend him, Elle. He made a lot of mistakes, and I don't know if he can come back from this. But I thought you should know." A heavy silence hung between them. Eleanor looked at Samantha, but her thoughts were elsewhere, reliving the moments she had shared with Steve, the promises made, the future they had planned together. All of it felt distant, like a dream that never really happened. She had been naive. For so long she believed that despite the difficulties, they could overcome anything. And now Steve was living with the consequences of his own actions, while she tried to rebuild from the pieces he left behind. "I thought this would make me feel better," Eleanor confessed, her voice fragile. "Knowing that he's paying for what he did, but I don't feel that way." Samantha watched her with empathy. "I get it, Hel. You've been through so much. It's not easy to move on from someone who hurt you so deeply. Sometimes revenge or justice doesn't fill the void that was left." Eleanor knew Samantha was right, but that didn't make things any easier. She looked at her hands, the same hands that had held Steve so many times, believing he would be her support until the end. Now, they felt empty. The man she loved had disappeared, both physically and emotionally, a long time ago. There was no way to bring the past back, nor to correct the mistakes they both had made. "Do you think he'll be arrested?" Eleanor finally broke the silence. Samantha shrugged, looking uncertain. "I don't know. The police are after him, but he managed to disappear for a while. Whatever happens, Steve got himself into something big, and the chances of him getting away with it are slim." The idea of Steve being imprisoned didn't bring the satisfaction Eleanor thought it would. Instead, there was an overwhelming weight in her chest. What had she gained? His suffering wouldn't erase what she had gone through. Steve was out of her life, but the scars he left were still deep. Part of her wanted to just move on, to forget he ever existed. But another part, a darker part, wanted to see him pay for everything, for the betrayal, for the theft, for the abandonment. "I don't know what to do with this," Eleanor admitted, her eyes meeting Samantha's. "Part of me wants him to suffer, to pay for everything, but at the same time I just want to move on. I want to leave this behind." Samantha leaned forward, holding Eleanor's hands. "No matter what you decide, Hel, you have the right to feel what you're feeling. Steve did a lot of wrong by you, but revenge won't bring you peace. You need to find your own way to deal with this." Eleanor sighed, feeling the conflicting emotions tightening around her heart. For so long she had been consumed by physical and emotional pain. The surgery had given her a new life, but the weight of the past was still there, like an anchor, preventing her from moving on completely. Maybe that was what was holding her back, the desire for justice, to see Steve suffer, but at the same time, the need to leave everything behind and find peace. Samantha stood up, realizing the conversation had reached a point of reflection. "I just wanted to tell you what happened. What you do with this information is up to you. But know that regardless of what Steve did, you are stronger than this. You have a new life ahead of you." Eleanor nodded, Samantha's words echoing in her mind. "Thank you, Sam, for telling me. I needed to know." As Samantha said her goodbyes and left, the silence of the house enveloped Eleanor once more. She slowly got up and walked to the window, gazing at the horizon. Samantha's words still echoed in her mind. Steve was missing, hunted by the police, while she now had a new chance. But what would she do with this new life? There were still so many unanswered questions. What did Eleanor really want? Revenge or peace? And what else had Steve done before disappearing completely? If you're still with us, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. Your support greatly helps the channel grow. Now let's move on to the revelation that changes everything. Eleanor woke up that morning with a slight sense of relief, something she hadn't felt in a long time. The sunlight streamed through the cracks in the curtain, casting golden patterns on the wooden floor. She stretched slowly, feeling her body still adjusting to the new health routine, but for the first time in months, there was something stronger than the pain or anguish. It was a feeling of purpose, a small spark of life being reborn within her. The past few weeks had been challenging, but also transformative. Ever since she started her craft business, Eleanor discovered that each day brought a new reason to keep going. Orders began to trickle in, and the feeling of creating something with her own hands, of watching her pieces come to life and be appreciated by others, brought back an energy she thought she had lost forever. At first, Sarah was a driving force, helping with the administrative side and promoting on social media. The fundraising campaign had been the initial push, but the true success came from the quality of Eleanor's products and her love for what she did. The days that were once consumed by loneliness and pain were now filled with work, ideas, and a steady stream of messages from satisfied customers. But it wasn't just work that brought about change. At one of the local craft fairs, where Eleanor decided to showcase her creations, she met Rafael Cruz. The encounter was casual, nothing special at first glance. He was attentively examining the pieces at her booth, carefully touching a colorful bead necklace she had made. Eleanor, distracted by a customer, hardly noticed when he approached. "This necklace is stunning," he said, catching Eleanor's attention with a calm smile. "Thank you," she replied, still focused on her sales. But there was something in the way he looked at her, as if he wasn't just admiring the work, but seeing something beyond the creations. Raphael wasn't the type of person she expected to find at that fair. A middle-aged man, well-dressed, with a firm posture, but without the arrogance that often accompanied those who had success in business. He continued to look at her other items, but instead of buying something, he initiated a deeper conversation. "Do you make all these pieces by yourself?" he asked, with genuine curiosity. Eleanor nodded. "Yes, each one of them. It's something I've always loved to do, but only recently decided to pursue it as a business." "That's amazing," he said with sincere admiration. "I run a consulting firm, and one of the things I always tell my clients is that finding a genuine purpose in your work is the secret to success. It seems like you've found yours." Eleanor smiled for the first time in a long while in front of a stranger. "I'm trying," she admitted. "It's still hard sometimes, but I feel like I'm on the right path." Raphael began to frequent Eleanor's booth at other fairs. He would buy one piece here and there, but always lingered longer than necessary, talking about life, business, and eventually their own scars. They discovered that they both carried painful pasts, wounds that took time to heal. He shared about the end of his marriage, the years he spent trying to find himself after the divorce, and how, like her, he was searching for a new purpose. Over time, their relationship evolved from a casual friendship into something deeper. Raphael became a constant presence in her life, someone she could trust and open up to, without fear of being judged for what she had gone through. He understood, in a way that few could, what it meant to start over when everything seemed to have been destroyed. As the weeks went by, Eleanor began to notice something unexpected. Her heart, which had been hardened by Steve's betrayal and the struggles she faced, was beginning to open again. It wasn't something she had planned, but it happened slowly and naturally. Raphael never pressured her, and perhaps that was what drew her to him the most. He respected her boundaries, understood that the past still cast shadows, but also saw beyond that, recognizing the woman she was becoming. However, even with the blossoming of this new relationship, Eleanor found herself thinking about Steve. It wasn't love she felt, but a strange sense of unease. Had she really left him behind? Would she be able to move forward completely, or would the emotional scars always weigh her down? Raphael seemed to notice this hesitation at times. One night, while they were sitting together in a cafe, he looked into her eyes and asked straightforwardly, "Have you been able to forgive him?" Eleanor fell silent for a moment, surprised by the direct question. She knew he was referring to Steve, but it was the first time Raphael had brought up the subject so openly. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "Part of me wants to move on, leave everything behind, but another part still feels the weight of what happened, and I don't know if I can just let that disappear." Raphael held her hand with a firm and comforting touch. "You don't need to rush it, Eleanor. Forgiveness isn't something that happens overnight. Sometimes it takes years, and sometimes it doesn't happen at all." Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling the truth in his words. The past, with all its pain and betrayals, was still a part of her, but she knew she was slowly freeing herself. Raphael was a new anchor, a steady support, but the healing process was hers, and no one could rush it. In the following days, Eleanor tried to focus on her business and her future with Raphael, but the shadow of Steve continued to linger in her mind. She wondered what had happened to him. Was he still trapped, running away, or had he found a way to disappear completely? One afternoon, while organizing her products for a new fair, the phone rang. Upon answering, a familiar voice on the other end froze her body. "Eleanor, it's me, Steve." She felt a chill run down her spine. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy, laden with something she didn't know if she wanted to uncover. What did Steve want now, after all this time? And how would this affect Eleanor's fresh start with Raphael? Eleanor remained silent, the phone still pressed against her ear, unsure whether to hang up or continue listening to Steve's voice on the other end of the line. The world seemed to slow down as her mind raced. He had destroyed her, betrayed her, and now, out of nowhere, he was back. What did he want? What could he possibly say that would justify everything he had done? "Eleanor, please, I know I'm the last person you want to hear from, but I need to talk to you." She didn't respond right away, emotions swirling through her like a storm. Part of her wanted to hang up and never think of him again. The other part, the one still carrying the pain, the resentment, and the betrayal, made her hesitate. Finally, she spoke, her voice icy. "What do you want, Steve?" I need to see you, to explain some things. Please, I know I don't have the right to ask for anything, but I'm desperate." The word desperate hammered in Eleanor's mind. The last time she saw him, he had left her in a state of desperation, and now, ironically, he was begging. She glanced at Raphael, who was sitting at the table, absorbed in a message on his phone, and felt a weight grow in her chest. Was this what she needed? To hear Steve out, confront the past, and finally move on? With a sigh, she replied, "Where are you?" The next day, she met Steve in a small cafe away from the city center. Eleanor had arrived early and sat by the window, watching cars pass by on the street. Her fingers tapped nervously on the table, her stomach churning with anxiety and anger. She didn't know what to expect, and that uncertainty made her anxious. When Steve walked in, she almost didn't recognize him. He looked worn out, thinner, with deep circles under his eyes and disheveled hair. The clothes he wore were tattered, and he walked as if carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. The sight weakened her, but at the same time ignited something within her, a bittersweet sense of justice and disgust. Steve approached hesitantly and sat down across from her, his eyes avoiding hers at first. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice low, almost broken. Eleanor remained silent, her hands crossed over the table, waiting for him to explain. Steve took a deep breath before continuing. "I know I can't justify what I did. I messed everything up. I abandoned you when you needed me the most, and there's no excuse for that. But Eleanor, I need you to understand that what I did was the worst decision of my life, and I've been paying for it every day." Eleanor felt her anger swell. "Do you think that matters? That saying you're paying for it now will erase everything that happened? Steve, you left me alone. Stealing the money was one thing, but abandoning me on the brink of death, I will never forget that." Steve leaned forward, his eyes finally meeting hers, filled with a desperate plea. "I know, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I tried to make it right. Before everything fell apart, I did something for you. Something that might explain a little of what I was going through." Eleanor looked at him, confused. "What are you talking about?" He took a deep breath, struggling against the tears threatening to fall. "I was the donor. I was the one who donated part of my liver to you." She froze. What he had said made no sense. Steve, the donor? She had always thought the anonymous donor was someone unknown, some faceless angel who had saved her life. The idea that Steve, the man who had abandoned her, could have done this was incomprehensible. "You're lying," she said, her voice sharp. "I'm not," Steve replied, tears streaming down his face. "I couldn't live with the guilt, so before I ran away I got tested. I knew I was a match and I made the donation. After everything, I thought this was the only way to redeem myself." Eleanor felt the ground crumble beneath her feet. The anger and hatred that had sustained her for so long were now being questioned. He had betrayed her. He had abandoned her, but he had also saved her. The conflicting emotions were too much to process. The man who had destroyed her life had also given her the chance to keep living. "Why didn't you tell me?" she managed to ask, her voice trembling. "Because I knew it wouldn't make a difference. Nothing I did would change what happened. But I couldn't let you die knowing I could save your life." Eleanor looked at him, his face wet with tears. Part of her wanted to scream, another part wanted to run away, but she stayed there, trapped between the past and the present, trying to understand how to deal with this revelation. Steve continued, "I don't expect you to forgive me, Eleanor. I just needed you to know. I destroyed everything, but at least I did one thing right." She abruptly stood up, the chair scraping against the floor. "I can't do this right now, Steve. I can't deal with this." He lowered his head, defeated. "I understand." Eleanor left the cafe, her heart racing, tears streaming down her face. Steve's words echoed in her head, mixed with the pain and confusion. She walked the streets aimlessly, trying to absorb the impact of what she had just discovered. When she finally got home, Raphael was waiting for her. He stood up as soon as he saw her enter, a worried expression on his face. "How was it?" Eleanor stopped in the middle of the living room, her eyes still glistening with tears. He told me he was the donor. Steve saved my life, Raphael. After everything, he was the one responsible for me being alive." Raphael watched her in silence, waiting for her to process what that meant. "And what are you going to do with that information?" Eleanor didn't know. Part of her wanted to forgive Steve, to free herself from the weight of the anger she carried. But another part, the part that still hurt, didn't know how to let that go. "Forgiving him isn't for him, it's for you," Raphael said, echoing words he had told her before. Eleanor looked at him, feeling torn between the need to move forward and the weight of the past still holding her back. Would Eleanor be able to forgive Steve, or would the wounds of the past still hold power over her future with Raphael? Eleanor stared at Raphael, still torn, his words reverberating in her mind. Forgiving him isn't for him, it's for you. She knew he was right, but the weight of what Steve had done was something hard to simply let go. How could she forgive someone who had left her on the brink of death, yet at the same time had saved her? The confusion was suffocating, and the tension between the past and the present became almost unbearable. "I don't know if I can forgive him, Raphael," Eleanor said, her voice wavering but filled with honesty. "Part of me feels that if I do, I'll be saying what he did was okay, but it's not. Nothing he did was right." Raphael, ever patient, watched her in silence, absorbing her words before responding. "Forgiveness doesn't mean erasing what he did, Hel. It means you're going to stop carrying that weight. If you keep holding on to that anger, the only one who will get hurt is you." She sighed, running her hands over her face. His logic was undeniable, but the emotions she carried were not easy to control. Letting go of the past felt like a distant step, especially now, with everything she had discovered about Steve. The following days blurred by. Eleanor kept herself busy with work, trying to distract herself from the emotional pain and the doubts that still loomed over her. Raphael remained by her side, giving her the necessary space, not pressuring her to make hasty decisions. He knew she was processing everything, and that took time. Then one day, while reorganizing her craft supplies in the makeshift studio, Eleanor heard the familiar sound of the mailman passing by. Thinking it was a package, she went to the door and picked up the envelope from the mailbox. When she looked at the sender, her heart skipped a beat. It was from Samantha, Steve's sister. With trembling hands, she opened the letter and began to read. Eleanor, I know our last conversation was difficult for you, and I'm sorry for leaving you with more questions than answers. I haven't heard from Steve since the last time we talked, but there's something you need to know about what he did before he disappeared. I know he told you he was the liver donor who saved your life, but I think you need to understand the full context. Steve knew he was making a mistake by running away, and he realized he couldn't turn back after everything he did. But even so, he wanted to somehow repair the damage. When he found out he was a match for you, he didn't hesitate to donate, even knowing it could cost him his own freedom. He used the little time he had before everything fell apart to ensure you had a chance to survive. I know he was terrible to you, but I want you to know that, deep down, Steve always cared, even if it was too late to fix things between you. Eleanor's hands shook as she held the paper. She couldn't believe what she was reading. Steve, the man who had emotionally destroyed her, had sacrificed part of himself to save her. The irony was too cruel. He made the right choice, but only after making all the wrong ones. And now, the weight of this revelation crashed down on her with a force she hadn't expected. As much as she wanted to hate him for everything he had done, this final act complicated everything. He had been cruel, yes, but he was also the reason she was alive. The hatred she held seemed to lose its strength, mingled with a profound sadness. Steve was lost, perhaps even beyond redemption, but in some way he had tried to do something right. Eleanor let the letter fall onto the table and walked to the window, looking out at the garden. The distant sound of birds and the gentle breeze through the trees contrasted with the emotional storm raging inside her. How could she move forward knowing that the man who caused so much damage was also the one who guaranteed her second chance? That night, Raphael came home to find Eleanor sitting on the porch, her gaze lost on the horizon. He approached quietly and sat beside her, waiting for her to speak. "I got a letter from Samantha today," she said, not taking her eyes off the darkening sky. "She confirmed what Steve said. He was the donor. He did it knowing he might never have another chance to escape. Even after everything he did, he still saved me." Raphael sat in silence for a moment before responding, weighing his words. "Does that change anything for you?" Eleanor sighed, the confusion still evident in her voice. "It changes things, but at the same time it doesn't. Steve saved me, but the damage he caused, it doesn't just disappear. It's like he tried to fix something broken with a piece that doesn't fit." Raphael nodded, understanding. Sometimes people make such huge mistakes that even their best deeds can't fix things. But that doesn't mean you have to carry that weight forever. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes filled with pain and confusion. "I want to leave this behind, Raphael, but it's hard. How do I forgive someone who destroyed my life even if he saved it afterward?" Raphael took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You don't have to have all the answers right now, Hel. Forgiveness is a process, and it's not something you do for him. It's something you do for yourself, to set yourself free." His words touched her deeply, but the path to forgiveness felt winding and uncertain. However, Eleanor knew she was beginning to move in the right direction. Steve had left an indelible mark on her life, but it didn't have to be a scar forever. Days passed, and slowly, Eleanor began to feel like she was truly letting go of the past. She still felt the pain of betrayal, but Steve's final act, the sacrifice he made, allowed her to see the complexity of people and the decisions we make. Her past with Steve would never be erased, but it also didn't have to define her future. Now she had Raphael, the business she loved, and above all, a new chance to live fully. The ghost of Steve would follow her for a while, perhaps forever, but the weight of it seemed lighter with each passing day. She was finally ready to move forward. This story shows us how life can be full of unexpected twists, and that people aren't always who we imagine them to be. A past filled with pain and betrayal can be hard to overcome, but it also teaches us about forgiveness, resilience, and finding strength within ourselves. In the end, what matters is how we deal with the scars and move forward. What would you do if you were in her place? How would you handle discovering that the person who saved your life was also the one who caused you the most pain? Let us know in the comments what you thought of this journey and share your opinion. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, now's the time. Subscribe, hit the notification bell so you don't miss any videos, leave a like, and tell us what moved you the most in this story. Don't forget to check out the next recommended video by clicking the card that appears on your screen. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.